Okay, today we're going to talk about heredity. Heredity is defined as the passing of genetic material from parents to offspring, so that's parents to children, a hen to its chicks, etc. Gregor Mendel was an Austrian monk in the 1800s, and some of you have already studied about Gregor Mendel. He did the first major experiments in heredity. He's known as the father of genetics. So he looked at 7 traits in pea plants that he just planted in the garden of the monastery where he was living and studying. So here are the 7 traits of the pea plants. 1, he looked at the flower color. Are the blossoms purple or white? The flower position, is it axial or terminal? So terminal would be at the end of the stem. Axial would be not at the end. The stem length, was the stem long or was it short? The shape of the seed, there were 2 shapes that he was coming across. One was round and one he called wrinkled. The seed color, was it yellow? Was it a yellow seed or a green seed? The pod shapes, were they inflated or constricted? So you might say the pods, if they were constricted, they looked like they had been vacuum packed possibly. And the last one was pod color. Was the color of the pod green or yellow? So some of us might wonder why did Mendel choose a pea plant? Well, here are some of the main reasons he chose a pea plant. 1, it's because it had a short reproductive period, meaning he could get a lot of peas quickly and get a lot more after he crossed them and bred and grew them again. The second one was that he had traits that were easy to see, and those peas made his work more obvious. It doesn't require much care. They need some sunshine and some rain. And then you can have hundreds of offspring to study, which goes along with the short reproductive time. You get a lot of offspring. Each characteristic had 2 different forms, and these different forms are called traits. So he kept this very simple by picking the pea plant because the traits could either be wrinkled or smooth. They were inflated or they were constricted. So he made it simple on himself by choosing a pea plant. So let's look at how traits are inherited from parent to offspring. Genes are defined as segments of DNA, and they're given instructions for producing a certain characteristic. So each of these different segments on this gamete have different instructions for certain characteristics that will be inherited by an offspring. How are they inherited? All organisms are produced from a blueprint or a set of genetic instructions that are inherited from their parents or their parent or parents. So in this case of a human, a phenotype, you can think of the pH as physical, what the physical appearance is, and the genotype is, think of the gene. It's what the gene says, okay? So phenotype is red hair, but the gene says these are the 2 genes that code for red hair. The offspring has 2 versions of the same gene for every characteristic, 1 from each parent. The different versions of a gene are called alleles. So you have an allele for your eye color from one parent and an allele for your eye color from another parent. So you have 2 alleles for eye color. Dominant alleles are shown in a capital letter. And this is really important that you understand this because this is kind of the code of genetics and understanding genetics. So if there's a capital letter, that tells you that that is the dominant allele. And a recessive allele is shown with a lowercase letter of the same letter. So if capital T stands for eye color, and that means that that's the dominant eye color trait, and then a lowercase t would be the recessive eye color trait. We're going to get into that more here. So dominant equals a trait that overpowers and hides another trait. So I use the capital T's here as well. So 2 capital T's, you only have that allele, capital T's. And recessive is a trait that's weak and can be hidden, so we don't see it. So lowercase little t's, the only way you would see a recessive trait is this situation right here where you have 2 lowercase. If you pair 1 dominant with 1 recessive, we will always see the dominant. And you won't know that the recessive is there until the next offspring. An organism with one dominant and one recessive allele for a gene is called heterozygous. So this is the situation I was just explaining, a big T, little t. It's heterozygous for that gene. And an organism with two of the same alleles for the gene is called homozygous. So if you have two dominant, two capital T's, you're homozygous for that trait, or two lowercase t's, you're homozygous for that gene. The dominant allele contributes to the phenotype, meaning the physical appearance, if one or two copies are present in the genotype. So let's say this is eye color again. So if this is brown eyes, which usually we call big B, but we'll say it's brown eyes, capital T, you will have brown eyes, and you will only have a capital T to pass on to your offspring. Or you could have this situation where you'd have brown eyes because you have a capital T, but you also have a lowercase t. So you could pass on to your offspring a capital T or a lowercase t. So well, I'll just use myself as an example. I have brown eyes. I didn't know that I was heterozygous until I had children and they all had blue eyes. So that means I passed on to them a lowercase t, and their father also he has blue eyes. He could only pass on a lowercase t. So we would both have, then we made children with lowercase t's, which are blue-eyed children. The recessive allele contributes to the phenotype only when two copies of it are present. So this is how they have blue eyes, because I gave a lowercase t, my husband gave a lowercase t, and they both have two lowercases, and a recessive is shown. Let's talk about hybrids. There's a lot of talk in the food world, especially about hybrids. We talk about GMOs a lot, genetically modified organisms. A hybrid is a mixture of a dominant and recessive traits. And we can make hybrids of all different things that have different traits that we like. For example, seedless watermelon. You mix a watermelon with one that had an incredibly low number of seeds, and pretty soon you do that enough times, you've bred out the seeds in the watermelon. So this is looking at tall trait from one parent. So there are heights. We have obviously passed on our heights to our children. A big T, little t, because it's a big T, just like the brown eyes, it's dominant, right? So that means the tall trait is going to be the phenotype, and this is the genotype. This is what the genes look like. You have one tall and one short. So a tall from one parent and a short from one parent, this is your genotype. The plant would be short or tall. And why? The plant would be tall because it has a T, a big T, a dominant trait. The dominant trait will overpower the recessive trait. How are traits inherited? Genotypes. The genotypes are the combination of alleles that you're inherited. So these are the letter combinations. These are the genes that you have. That's why it's called a genotype. A phenotype, this is really important that you write this down, so make sure you're taking these notes. Phenotype, think of as physical. What's the physical appearance? What's observable? So are you tall or short? Do you have brown eyes or blue eyes? Red hair or blonde hair? There are some different ways that we can inherit genes, and then there are different ways that those are physically shown. So there's complete dominance. There's complete dominance, where the dominant allele and the other contains a recessive allele, and the dominant allele determines a phenotype. So this is the brown eyes or the tall trait that we just showed. So if you have a capital T, you're going to be tall. This is called complete dominance. If you have a dominant allele, the dominant will be what shows in the phenotype. Complete dominance. The dominant completely masks the recessive. If we're talking pea plants, you wouldn't even know the recessive is there until the second generation, possibly. Genes. Some characteristics are the result of several genes acting together. So sometimes one gene influences more than one trait. For example, some genetic disorders like sickle cell anemia are linked to a single gene, but they can affect many different traits. If you're interested in something like sickle cell anemia, I would encourage you to look that up. It's an interesting genetic disorder. Acquired traits. So not all things are given to you by your parents. Sometimes the environment can influence your phenotype. So some traits are acquired only from your environment and not from being inherited from a parent. For example, your ability to read and write. That is a trait that you've acquired since birth, not something that was passed on by your parents. Okay, so here are some examples of some inherited traits that you have. A widow's peak, if you pull back the hair on your forehead, where some of you may have bangs, if you have kind of like a V, your hairline comes into a V in the center of your forehead, that's a widow's peak. A hitchhiker's thumb is when you give a thumbs up and your thumb points backwards. The other option is not a hitchhiker's thumb, which your thumb just is straight up. Your earlobes, you can have attached or unattached earlobes. So you might have to stand in front of the mirror and see, do your earlobes attach to the side of your head or do they hang down a little bit and are unattached? Since we're not in school, we can't do the PTC paper, but this is an interesting experiment where I have this piece of paper, a little strip of paper that you put on your tongue and taste. And for some people, it tastes really bitter, and for others, it tastes like nothing. So that is an inherited trait, that bitterness that you can taste, or you're a non-taster. Here are some traits that are acquired. This is like reading and writing. Okay, they're acquired from your environment. You've acquired the ability to ride a bike, or to swim, or to tie your shoes, or to whistle. Originally, we would have traveled around the room and we would have found which classmates have widow's peaks or earlobes that are attached or unattached, or who can taste the paper and who can't. But we're not in the classroom. So I would say it would be interesting for you to travel around to your family members and ask if you can interrupt their work for just a minute and look at some of these inherited traits and ask them about some of these acquired traits. Can you read and write? Can you ride a bike? Can you swim? Can you tie your shoes? Can you whistle? Winking. That could be something too that's an acquired trait. So ask 3 family members. See if you can find 3 people to ask, even calling them on the phone or Zooming with your FaceTime or Skype with your grandparents or your cousins. See, or a friend, and see what your friends find, what you find in them. Okay, so we've talked about complete dominance. So the opposite of this is incomplete dominance, where each allele has an influence in the phenotype. So big T, little t, if we're talking tall, would result in a medium height person. So in incomplete dominance, this results in a phenotype that's a blend of the two. So for human hair, a person with one allele for straight hair and one allele for curly hair will end up having wavy hair. Here is an example of flowers. So the P generation is the parent generation. So you can see here are the 2 alleles, right? This red flower has trait C for red, and this one has trait C for white. When red and white cross, you get a partial red, a partial white, which makes a pink plant. In the F2 generation, and we'll talk about this in our Punnett squares work, we put one parent here and one parent here, and we can see if 2 pinks were crossed, red, white, 2 pinks were crossed, we have 1/4 of a chance, 1 out of 4, that we're going to get a red plant, 1 out of 4 that we're going to get a white plant, and 1/2 or 2 out of 4 chances that we're going to get a pink plant. So codominance can be very interesting. Both traits are contributing. They're heterozygous individuals, and they are associated with 2 alleles. Human blood type is part of codominance. 3 alleles play a role in this in determining blood type. So you have an allele for A blood type, a B blood type, or if it's missing, it's O. That's where O comes from, no A's or B's. So if you get, let's say you get one A allele from one parent and one B allele from another parent, you have type AB blood. So here's an example of codominance in blood types. Parent A gives type A, parent B gives type B. And so what they can make is A looks like this. It's an A and an O, and B looks like this, a B and an O. So they can make all these different combinations. They can have a child with every type imaginable, every blood type possible. This is type A blood. They get one A from this parent and the O from this parent. This one gets the A from dad and the B from mom and makes it type AB. This one gets a type A from dad and an O from mom, which makes type B blood, and this one gets an O